All right. So again, this is Mark Dyson with Rocky Mountain Institute. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for joining us before the 4th of July. Appreciate you spending the time. Just to quickly go over the agenda for today's call, we'll talk for hopefully less than 40 minutes and then leave plenty of time for Q&A. Please enter any questions you have in the GoToWebinar box on the left side of your screen or the right side of your screen. We can address kind of small clarifying questions as they come up, and then larger discussion questions we'll try to address towards the end. Folks are going to remain muted just to keep everyone sane and avoid some IT issues, and then we'll address questions that you enter as text. We're going to record this, and we'll share the recording publicly and then with attendees tomorrow or towards the end of this week probably. And then any feedback that you have or further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. elab@rmi.org is the best place to reach us. So first we'll talk through kind of myself and Alex's introduction, and then give some context for the report. We'll give kind of the overview of the study that we conducted and some of the rationale that we took in setting up the work. And then Alex will talk through the findings and the implications or recommendations. And again, happy to address Q&A as it comes up. So I'll introduce myself first, and then Alex, please chime in as well. So I'm Mark Dyson, principal at RMI with our electricity program, been working at the Institute since 2008. I lead some of our work looking at infrastructure investment on the grid, and I help to lead this the preparation of this paper that we're discussing today. Alex?
Yeah, so my name is Alex Engel, and I've been an associate here at RMI for just about a year now. And the main project I've been working on is the modeling behind this report and the co-authoring the report itself. And then in addition to that, I've worked on some of our convening work and a project where we're analyzing the impact of the changing energy landscape on Western cooperatives and their opportunities in the clean energy transition.
Thanks, Alex. And I just want to note that Jamil Farbs was an additional author critical to this work. He has since left RMI, but wanted to make sure he was acknowledged in this webinar as well. Great, so we'll start with the context. I think the thing that drove this work originally was a recognition that we have a very old generating fleet in this country. Over half of thermal capacity is 30 years old or more. And it's been increasing investment in recent years and decades has been increasingly focused on natural gas. So the spike that you see towards the right side of the screen here shows basically nothing was built in the United States except natural gas fired power plants for 10 years. So when you look at this fleet of power plants and you assume that everything that's on the grid today retires at approximately the same age as units that have retired in the last 10 years, we come to the conclusion that we're going to lose to age and economics about half of the thermal capacity of the U.S. grid by 2030. We see that could accelerate even given trends in recent years of low electricity pricing in wholesale markets that is continuing to push older inefficient assets out of the market. As these thermal power plants retire, the default choice for utilities and independent power producers to replace this retiring capacity for the last decade has also been new natural gas fired power plants. So this map shows in dark blue the proposed combined cycle or higher efficiency, typically base load units proposed for construction. The light blue circles show combustion turbines or less efficient, less expensive peaking capacity proposed for construction. All told, there's over 100 gigawatts and $100 billion of announced investment in new gas capacity across the United States. If you extrapolate the trend of replacing every retiring asset with a new natural gas plant of a similar type, so combined cycle for a baseload retirement or peaker for a lower capacity factor unit retirement, that would add to about $500 billion in CapEx by 2030 to replace all those retiring plants. And actually running all of those plants from today through 2030 as they're installed at average capacity factors would cost another $400 to $500 billion in mostly natural gas purchases while emitting 5 billion tons of CO2. So there's a clear kind of cost and carbon implication to the current rush to gas that we see today. At the same time, though, we have seen in the last 10 years, and we expect to continue to see, the price coming down for wind, solar, and batteries in particular. So this chart shows the normalized price, so pegged at 100 in 2017, of wind in light blue, solar in the middle blue, and then lithium-ion batteries in the darker blue. They've come down between 65 and 90% in the last 10 years in price, and forecasts from analysts including Green Tech Media Research, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, LBNL, and others suggest that those technologies could come down at least another 50% in price by 2030. And this is unsubsidized pricing, so not dependent on tax credits. So even as natural gas seems to be dominating market share for replacing retiring capacity today, other options are rapidly seeming to get more and more economic. In addition to being very economic, new types of resources are increasingly able to provide the full set of grid services, including reliability services that have traditionally been provided by natural gas-fired power plants. So this chart shows in the rows different services that the grid needs. So volt var compensation, short circuit contribution at the top, all the way down to long-term availability and black start at the bottom, but the full spectrum of reliability services that is required to run a reliable power grid. The columns show on the left the traditional synchronous assets, so coal, gas, nuclear, and hydro generators, and then moving towards the right, inverter-based and then demand-side resources as well. And the balls in the cells indicate to what extent each of these technologies is able to provide the service corresponding to that row. And we've shaded here a set of inverter-based technologies, demand technologies, and then as well as synchronous condensers that together, this dark blue cloud over on the right covers the gamut of essential reliability services. And these have increasingly been demonstrated in pilots and at commercial scale in new resource deployments across the country. So again, in addition to getting very cost-effective, wind, solar, batteries, and other resources are increasingly capable of providing the full set of reliability services that the grid needs. So the purpose of the study then was to look at how you could combine different portfolios of these emerging resources to provide the same set of grid services that a given natural gas-fired power plant could. So we looked at this in the lens of a clean energy portfolio. So what combination of energy efficiency technologies, demand flexibility, wind, solar, and storage could meet the set of grid services that would otherwise be provided by a gas plant. So this chart is actually it's an illustrative version of one of the charts in our paper, and that it shows kind of at an intuitive level how these different technologies combine to meet the three biggest constraints that are required by the grid and that would be met by a new gas-fired power plant. So annual energy, how much energy, what capacity factor can this portfolio of resources run throughout the year. And actually we as Alex will describe in a minute, we constrained it even further down to make sure that it could meet monthly energy requirements. In the middle, peak capacity, how reliable could this set of resources be during the peak hour of the year when the system is stressed and needs capacity the most? And then finally on the right, to what extent can this portfolio of resources mitigate the ramp rate imposed by changes in load or changes in renewable availability, and then even dynamically adapt to that in the case of demand flexibility and storage. So again, we looked, the basic premise of the study is to set up portfolios of these emerging cost-effective and capable resources to provide the same set of grid services that would otherwise be provided by natural gas-fired power plants. This slide is meant to show that we are not the only ones thinking about this question. So here's a map of the United States, and we've called out a number of states where either utilities are proposing or regulators are asking for or intervenors are recommending alternatives to new gas generation. And even since we put the final version of this report together in this map, there have been a number of new proposals across the country that continue to reinforce that this basic trend towards looking at non-gas alternatives is accelerating as folks recognize the locked-in cost and emissions impacts of heavy investment in new gas. However, the current market that we see is relatively small. So we cited a number here of less than 5 gigawatts, and what that has mostly been is peaker replacement or peaker deferral, or I call it undifferentiated baseload replacement. So the example here is some of the nuclear retirements in California. There hasn't necessarily been strong kind of peak capacity or flexibility requirements that have been imposed by these retirements. Rather, the energy and other kind of higher level grid services, including capacity, are getting filled in by portfolios of clean energy as opposed to a one-for-one asset replacement. So again, the premise here is that there is an opportunity for the market to grow from the single-digit gigawatts that we see today to kind of the hundreds of gigawatts that is proposed for new gas-fired builds in the U.S. over the next 15 years. So with that, I'll pass it over to Alex, who will talk about the setup that we took in order to kind of create our modeling framework, pick our case studies, and prepare our results. So Alex, I think you have control if you want to click through and advance the slides yourself.
Cool, thank you. I don't seem to. Oh, okay, sorry about that. So as Mark said, I'll give a brief overview of the study and particularly the cases we chosen and the model we used. So the study looked at 4 different proposed natural gas plants to assess the relative cost competitiveness of clean energy portfolios. And the different cases we chose were meant to capture 2 kinds of diversity that we think are important. The first is diversity in grid characteristics and grid needs, and the proposed plant is meant to serve. So in that respect, we have 2 combined cycles that primarily provide energy, and 2 combustion turbines focus more on flexibility and capacity. And then the second sort of type of diversity that we're interested in capturing is the regional diversity in the potential of clean energy portfolio resources, which often have regionally specific potentials. And on this, there's sort of 2 major categories. And the first is renewable resource potential, and then the second is efficiency and demand flexibility potential, which is driven by the end use profiles that make up the load for the region. So moving on to the model. So for the study, we created a modeling tool to create optimized clean energy portfolios for each case. So the model we built really breaks down into 4 key components. The first, which Mark mentioned a little bit, which is the service requirement. So this is where we estimate the monthly energy, top hours of capacity, and flexibility needs of the system that the proposed gas plant is meant to serve. The second part is resource potential, which is where we estimate the renewable potential for the region and also the sector level as well as end use level potential for efficiency and demand flexibility programs. The third part is resource cost, and this is where we estimate the present value of the capital expenditures and operational expenditures for the various different clean energy portfolio resources that we include as options. And then the fourth and final piece is the portfolio optimizer, which takes the results from those other, from 1, 2, and 3 and constructs the lowest cost clean energy portfolio that provides the same services as the gas plan as they were identified in the service requirement component. And then thinking a little more about our approach and the philosophy behind the model, our approach to assessing the economics of clean energy portfolios was conservative, and we think it was conservative in 4 important respects. The first is the single resource scope of the model. So our optimization is based on a clean energy portfolio directly replacing a gas plant, whereas a more cost-effective solution would probably account for other existing resources on the system and other investment option. And in some sense, this ties in with the next conservatism, which is that we assume that there are no distributed benefits. And so we assign no value to the services provided to the transmission or distribution system from storage, demand flexibility, and efficiency. And the third part is that we say there is zero cost fuel. There's zero fuel cost risk and CapEx risks. So we don't assign any cost to the risk of fuel price volatility, nor the risk of lumpy ongoing gas plant capital expenditures, which are in contrast to the stage deployment and fairly predictable ongoing costs that are common to most of the clean energy portfolio components that we look at. And then the last is we assume no cost of carbon pricing or risk that might come into play. So we assign no cost to carbon and other emissions and do not quantify the risk of a future non-zero carbon price. So now moving on to the specific findings. So at a high level, looking at all 4 case studies, the very high level results are that clean energy portfolios are cost competitive with gas plants. And just a note on this chart, the full height of the stacked bar represents the gross or total of the clean energy portfolio cost in present value terms. The net cost, which is shown by the darker blue at the bottom of the stack, represents the cost of the clean energy portfolio less the value of netted energy savings. Now those energy savings represent the energy generated by the clean energy portfolio in excess of the amount determined in the service requirement. And then to that quantity of energy, we assign a value which is equal to the marginal cost of electricity from a low-cost combined cycle gas plant, so a very modern, efficient plant burning cheap gas. And then just a quick clarification, which is that the optimizer minimized gross cost, not net. So the energy savings of a portfolio didn't have any impact on how the construction was built or how the the portfolio was built, excuse me. So getting into the different kinds of cases, for the combined cycle cases, the clean energy portfolios are between 8% cheaper and 6% more expensive in net cost terms. The combustion turbines were probably more dramatic, and in these cases, the clean energy portfolios are 40 to 60% cheaper in net cost terms. And looking at those cases sort of all together, we can say that the clean energy portfolios would save $300 million and avoid 160 million tons of carbon emissions over the next 20 or so years. Let's see, having some trouble advancing. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So now getting into the specific cases, the first case is the West Coast combined cycle plant. And the utility here has some solar on its system and is planning a lot more. And that has the effect of pushing the system's net peak later in the day. And you can see the results of that pretty starkly in this portfolio. And you see that particularly in the wind, or the large amount of wind in the portfolio, which provides energy. And particularly in winter, and more consistent capacity throughout the day than solar or other potential resources. And then in addition, the substantial amount of storage helps provide capacity during summer evenings as well as winter, when the potential of key energy efficiency and demand flexibility end uses, such as air conditioning, are more limited in the region. And taking a look at the breakdown of costs for this energy portfolio. So the breakdown of cost of the West Coast clean energy portfolio. It's dominated by wind, with storage edging out efficiency for second place. Without the additional energy, the clean energy portfolio is 2% less costly than the gas plant versus 8% when including the additional energy. Bring that down a little bit more. The wind and efficiency provide all energy and around half of the capacity, while accounting for 80% of the cost. Whereas demand flexibility provides significant capacity and flexibility between 20 and 30%, depending on which of those measures you're talking about. And it does that for less than 4% of the total cost. And this points to the considerable value you can get from demand flexibility. And then looking at the Florida combined cycle case, which is the second one. So under the base case assumptions, which is what we're showing here, this clean energy portfolio is 6% more expensive than its gas plant equivalent. And while these two options are very similar costs, they have vastly different risks. And this is here referring to the difference between the clean energy portfolio and the gas plant having essentially nearly comparable costs, but they do have very different risks. For the gas plant, 2/3 of the cost is operational or operations expenditures, and 90% of that is fuel. In contrast to the clean energy portfolio, which has 3 times the gas plant's upfront costs, but provides large amounts of energy at essentially no marginal cost. And so the clean energy portfolio, if it was built, could essentially help stabilize rates for the utility, which would otherwise be exposed to volatile natural gas prices. And digging a little bit deeper into a sensitivity case for the Florida combined cycle, let's see. The potential cost declines for distributed solar projects or modest carbon pricing would put the clean energy portfolio at cost parity with the gas plant. So in the base case, transmission cost for renewables increases the delivered solar levelized cost by about 13%, which would be above the normal sort of bus bar costs. So taking a look at that and saying, well, what if we looked at distributed solar, probably at sort of a community scale, and if the price of that kind of solar were to fall to 33%, or excuse me, to $33 a megawatt, which is comparable to observed bids in the region, you end up with a portfolio that does reach cost parity with the gas plant, and it does that by shifting the various different parts, and you end up building 70% more solar, and which helps bring it to cost parity and also decrease the wind, which is fairly high cost because it has to be imported from an area with superior wind resources to Florida. Alternatively, a modest carbon price of about $7.50, $7.50 a ton would also bring the clean energy portfolio to cost parity with the gas plant. Sorry. Okay, so looking at the least cost portfolios for the Mid-Atlantic and Texas combustion turbines, they're dominated by demand response and energy efficiency. And the particular end uses that get selected within those larger categories depend on a number of factors, and significant among those are regional climate, grid needs, and sort of the installed base of different end uses, and how, to what extent their energy source is electricity. In the Texas case, residential air conditioning demand response is the largest resource, as it matches net load well. Whereas in the Mid-Atlantic case, the emphasis on winter capacity drives selection of space heating, both for efficiency and demand flexibility. And for both cases, they select significant amounts of water heating demand flexibility, as it represents a relatively consistent load throughout the day and year, and so is a very high value demand response resource. So looking at on the cost side, the clean energy portfolios for both the combustion turbine cases are roughly 15% cheaper than the gas plant on a gross basis, and 50% cheaper on a net basis. And the capital expenditures for both clean energy portfolios is roughly comparable with that of the gas plant, and actually lower in the Mid-Atlantic case. We also see energy efficiency dominating the cost of both portfolios, and the other large cost is storage in the Mid-Atlantic case, driven by the winter peaking needs when other capacity resources are less available. And that, I will hand it back to Mark to put some of these results into the larger context, and talk about some of the implications. And
thanks, Alex. So Alex, if you could give us back.
I'll just take it.
Okay. Sorry. So we're trying to figure out the keyboard and mouse control here. But I wanted to say that while we're doing that, let's see, can we click through here now? Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so Alex just walked through kind of the breakdown of the different portfolios that we found to be least cost across all 4 case studies. And I wanted to raise up a point that has come up in some of our discussions about this work, and that is that each of the portfolios rely on significant investment in energy efficiency to arrive at the specific least cost portfolio that we found. So I'll say a couple things about that, because I think it's an important point to address. The first is that we do constrain energy efficiency selection in the optimizer according to kind of the size of the utility in question. So we don't say, for instance, that any of these gas plants could just take efficiency from all across the region that they're in and use it to obviate their need. No, it's constrained based on which utility is kind of sponsoring the gas plant and could alternatively sponsor the energy efficiency programs. The other thing I'll say is that we do model this at average cost for the industry. So we're using an estimate of what utilities have paid in recent years to achieve cost savings. And so we're valuing this at kind of an industry benchmark. And then the final thing I'll say, which is represented on this slide, is that even the levels of efficiency that we've modeled are lower than average efficiency procurement year on year that we see from large U.S. utilities. So what I mean to say is that in each of these cases, the utility in question could procure energy efficiency at a below average rate, if you will, and still come up with enough efficiency to produce the cost-effective portfolio to offset the gas plant in question. So I just wanted to raise that as kind of a sticking point of the analysis, but something that we thought about and we choose to include because it is quite a reasonable estimate of efficiency that we've made. And I just wanted to note that we are getting your questions as they're coming in. Thank you for those. I think most of them, we'll address towards the end in the Q&A section, but thanks for submitting questions and keep them coming. So I guess the one important finding, Alex just talked through the economics for looking at a new build gas-fired power plant versus a new build set of renewables, battery storage, energy efficiency, and demand flexibility. But clearly, gas technology, the CapEx is not coming down in price, and depending on what you believe about gas fuel, could go up or down. But on the renewable side, the technologies are expected to come down dramatically in price. So we also wanted to understand at what point could clean energy portfolios beat just the operational costs of running an existing gas-fired power plant, let alone beat the levelized costs of building and running a new gas-fired power plant. So this chart shows the result of that analysis. The y-axis is dollars per megawatt hour. The red dashed lines represent the operational costs of a new highly efficient combined cycle gas turbine at $3 per MMBTU, which is approximately the present price for gas today. So that's the lower dashed red line. The upper dashed red line is the same number, but for $5 gas. And those translate to operating costs for highly efficient combined cycle generators between $23 and $36 per megawatt hour. The green lines that we've superimposed on top of those represent the levelized costs of an optimized clean energy portfolio for our West Coast case and for our Florida case, built new in each year, shown on the x-axis. So what you're seeing then before 2025 is that building a new clean energy portfolio would cost slightly more than running an existing gas plant at $5 gas up through about 2025. In 2026, both portfolios are less expensive to build new than running existing plants at $5 gas. And by 2040, both portfolios are essentially at cost parity or cheaper than running an existing gas plant at $3 gas. So again, depending on what you believe about the future price of natural gas, you could build a new portfolio for cheaper than it costs to run an existing gas plant anywhere from 8 to 20 years from now. And what does that mean for investors? It means that if you build a new gas plant today, you're placing a bet that it will continue to be cost effective in the market throughout its useful life. But what we're showing in this chart is that across two widely different geographies, that is not the case, again, depending on what you believe the future price of gas will be, which has important implications for both investors and utilities making investments in new gas-fired generators that we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. The final finding that we'd like to share with you is around the market size. So I mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, the outlook for new gas in the United States is approximately $500 billion in CapEx and $500 billion in gas purchases to run those power plants through 2030. So that's an undiscounted sum. So if you discount that back to 2018 dollars, you get to about $700 billion in net present value, which is the left bar. That is the business as usual cost for building and running new gas-fired generation to replace retiring coal, nuclear, and gas plants in the United States grid. What we did was look at to what extent could investment in renewables, efficiency, demand flexibility, and storage offset that at a national level, building on some of the analysis we did for our case studies, but also looking across the entire country. And where we ended up with that is at least half of the cost of new natural gas-fired construction and operation could be offset at a net cost savings by prioritizing construction of new renewables, efficiency, storage, and demand flexibility instead. And that would be at a net cost savings to U.S. electricity customers. So this represents a many-fold increase in the market size for all of those alternative resources and a less than positive outlook for growing the market for new natural gas in the United States. So I think we've touched on some of these before, but I wanted to finish up the presentation with the discussion of the implications and recommendations that have come out of this work. So first, talk about the stranded asset risk that I was just discussing. I'll say again, we see about 100 billion, or I think 112 billion of proposed natural gas-fired power plants in the queue across the country today. That was the map I showed you. About 90 billion of those are merchant power plants. So that means that private investors, or kind of the dereg side of electric utilities, are proposing to build new gas and will accept essentially market returns for the investment in that asset. And what we're showing in our analysis is that sooner rather than later, those natural gas plants could be competed on an operating cost basis by new clean energy portfolios, including renewables and batteries and other resources. So this represents potentially enormous downside for private investors looking at new gas as a returns generating mechanism for their investments today. And it would, in most cases here, it would be private investors, not necessarily regulated utilities, on the hook when these bets go bad. The second point is that around 20% of the proposed natural gas-fired plants are actually under construction or proposed for construction by vertically integrated regulated utilities. And in this case, it's not as clear what might happen when clean energy portfolios start to meaningfully outcompete just the operating costs of those plants. And the naive interpretation would be that customers, in most cases, would be on the hook to continue paying the investing utility for that capacity, for that asset, even in the face of newly competitive resources that could undercut its operating costs. And the conclusion here is that regulators play an important role, state-level regulators play an important role in assuring that proposed investment in new natural gas is in the customer's best long-term interest in these vertically integrated settings. So the last slide here, and then we can turn to some of the questions that we've gotten, is just the quick set of recommendations, and you can find the fuller set in the report that we have come to after this work for three main actors. So first, for regulators and market operators, I think the headline is to study alternatives to new natural gas and then level the playing field to make sure that those alternatives can effectively compete. So studying alternatives could be getting broad and real-time input on alternative technologies. We've seen, for example, a number of planning and procurement efforts across the United States in the last year that have explicitly sought present day and robust input from the market and understanding what resources are available and how much they cost in assessing the competitiveness of new gas versus other options. Aligning incentives is important. There's a set of resources that we've modeled here, including demand flexibility and energy efficiency, that don't typically generate the same returns for investor-owned utilities that investment in generation capital does. And for clean energy portfolios to effectively displace gas, we think it's essential to address that mismatch in incentives between lowering customer costs by avoiding new gas and actually generating returns on invested capital. And then finally, opening up market participation for DERs. We're seeing this already with FERC Order 841 and the pending order on other DERs participating in wholesale markets. So momentum is strong in opening up market participation to fully allow distributed energy resources to compete with traditional forms of capacity. For utilities, I mentioned the demonstrations we're seeing from utilities in planning and procurement. I think that's going to be key to unlocking the potential of clean energy portfolios related versus new gas. There's a few components of that. The first is actually the tools and processes by which utilities are planning. And again, we're seeing some innovative proposals across the country and updating those processes to better reflect the economics and capabilities of emerging resources. On the procurement side, the 2 points there are to not necessarily pilot proven technologies over and over again across the country. I think that there's we see utilities moving forward with scaled deployment of things that have been piloted and proven in peer utility neighborhoods, peer utility footprints, and thus avoid kind of the, quote, death by pilot that we see for some innovative technologies across the country. And then finally, there's a movement towards procuring solutions, not necessarily technologies. So the advent of the all sources RFP is an example that we're seeing in the market today of utilities asking pretty generally for the set of technologies that could help them meet an identified need, as opposed to specifying a specific subset of technologies that they're comfortable with. Finally, the recommendation for technology providers and project developers is to actually tailor their product to combine with others and meet the services that the grid needs. So that means seamless integration of multiple technologies. It means getting rid of some of the soft costs of customer acquisition and technology integration that we've seen limiting procurement of innovative technologies, and then providing data in a transparent way to generate confidence in the solutions that new technologies can offer. So again, these are some of the recommendations that we've seen and that we actually see being reflected in the market today to take advantage of the economics of clean energy portfolios. So with that, I'd like to turn to questions, and I'm just going to talk through them in the order in which they were received. Or
I would suggest something more about gas prices and
sure. Sure. So we'll step through these in a little bit of a logical order. So there was a question about the assumptions about future natural gas prices. So you saw in one of the last charts I showed, the $3 and $5 numbers. Those were kind of the bookends for the stranded asset evaluation. For the core case, we used the EIA's low oil price, gas price benchmark from last year. There's a question about has the study been peer reviewed outside of RMI? We had a set of experts review the study. They're acknowledged on the second or third page of the PDF. They were experts, project developers, former regulators, a number of folks. So yeah, we feel very comfortable that we've represented the situation properly given the expert input. And then there was another question about, is there evidence that investors agree with your conclusions? Yeah, actually, there is. GE had a very publicized dip in its share price due to the narrative was around the bad bet that it made in doubling down on new gas as a growth opportunity. So that came out the same week as our report was released. We see other investors looking at the PJM capacity market results and seeing how much uncleared gas there was that was in the queue. That's kind of another hint that the market is cooling. There was for utilities, we've seen a number of both regulators and utilities take similar action. So the most salient example for me in Arizona, the Arizona Corporation Commission imposed a 9-month moratorium on new gas builds and asked that its regulated utilities come with proposals for alternatives instead of signing contracts for new gas. A similar situation has played out in California. And then the last example I'll mention is, 2 major utilities, PacifiCorp and Xcel Energy, have both just released integrated resource planning proposals that both contain no new thermal assets, gas or coal, for the entire outlook of their planning horizon. Instead, they're filling capacity needs and retiring energy providing resources with renewable energy, and in some cases batteries. So again, we see from investors, from regulators, and utilities an acknowledgement that some of the ideas that we're presenting here are in their interest as well.
How about the differences in national?
Yeah, so there's a question about, does the optimization apply to Eastern or Western interconnection or some footprint of an ISO or RTO? So what we did was we looked at the specific utility or balancing area jurisdiction associated with each of our case studies. So there's 2 in the East, 1 in the, sorry, is that right? Yeah, 2 in the Eastern, 1 in Texas, and 1 in the Western interconnect is the direct answer to the question. There's a question about the T&D system, whether it's accurate to assign 0 value to the transmission and distribution system of behind-the-meter assets as a conservatism. And the challenge is, could a more distributed grid imply a higher need for low-voltage infrastructure? That's an interesting question. I don't think the scale at which we were analyzing this would necessarily imply that, because what we were looking at was essentially one of the main cost drivers on the T&D system is peak capacity over the long term, and we analyzed the extent to which, or we could have analyzed the extent to which the resources selected would mitigate peak on the T&D system. If you were looking at a longer term kind of more market shaping future, you might find other sources of added cost, but I don't think that work is prospective at this point. I don't think anybody is well situated to understand what the actual costs are, but it's an area for future study. Thanks for raising it. So there's a question about revenue estimation. Does the study consider potential higher revenues for CCGTs versus renewables? Examples include more revenues in the capacity market, ancillary service market prices. So let's take each of those. So in the capacity market, it may be accurate to say that in today's PJM capacity performance product, the CCGT would have an advantage in terms of revenue. There's a longer conversation that we could have about whether the capacity performance product is accurately representing the value that some of these resources can provide to the system at actual hours of peak need. And in fact, PJM was just basically told to revamp its capacity market entirely last Friday by FERC. And so this is a little bit of a moving target. So I guess the short answer is no, we didn't look specifically at the market products in each of these cases. We didn't do a case in PJM. But if we did, what we did do was look at the actual contribution to system peak, and that is in many ways kind of a better representation in some ways of the quality of each of these resources. And then in terms of ancillary services, we didn't directly look at that either. I think there's plenty of evidence from pilot programs and actual commercial deployments. For example, what's happening in South Australia right now with Tesla's 100 megawatt battery, that in particular batteries, but also inverter-based renewables and demand flexibility programs can provide all the same set of ancillary services and get paid for them. And in some cases get paid more for them because they can perform better than CCGTs in ramping up and down quickly to respond to, for example, a regulation signal. So anyways, again, the short answer is we didn't directly look at that, but we see plenty of evidence from the market that this other set of resources can perform as well or better than some of these products currently recognize, or than the CCGTs they'd be replacing.
Last two.
So the question was around, how do existing electricity rates in the 4 states compare? How do they compare with the Heartland or Midwest states? So I don't have the answer in front of me. The West Coast case, the plant in question was serving a low-cost utility for California, but that would still place it above probably average Midwestern rates. I believe rates in Florida are relatively low. North Carolina is near the average. So I don't know that I have the answer, but I think they're all probably pretty close to average. And in general, what we were optimizing against was not necessarily rates, but bulk system costs, essentially wholesale market costs that would kind of go through a whole nother process at the utility to make it to the rates. There was a question about operating cost assumption for storage. That is a question that we don't have time in the last 4 minutes, because it's fairly complicated. Alex, I'd love for you to take a crack at this in kind of the 1 minute version of the answer. How did we build up an OpEx assumption for storage?
Sure. Let's see. The main component, which we take, or at least we take the idea of it from the Lazard levelized cost of levelized cost of storage, and that largest component is what they call augmentation costs, and so those are the costs of maintaining the performance of a system over time based on whatever its building specifications were. So that generally means adding cells as the total capacity of the system degrades over time. And so that's the largest, I think, yeah, that's definitely the largest component of the storage marginal cost or operational cost. One thing we don't include is charging, but we basically remove that amount from, we make sure in a post-processing step that there was sufficient energy in excess of service requirements to charge the batteries for the amount that they were used. I think that's the relatively short version.
Thanks, Alex. So we've got probably time for one more question. There's a handful of questions that we didn't get to answer. I encourage you guys to follow up with me or Alex. So the question was, what are the major assumptions or drivers that could change the conclusions of the study? What resources could become more important? And I think that's a good one to end on. I think, one thought is we set this up last year towards the end of the year, and since that has happened, realized renewable costs in the market have come down significantly. We see Xcel in Colorado signing wind PPAs for $11. We see a new record of around $20 or $23 with no escalator for solar in Nevada. I guess the point here is that costs for renewables are coming down faster than many people expected, even last year when we put together the database we're using for this study. So that's going to be a major driver as to what extent can renewable prices keep coming down, and that would clearly impact the results of our work. The other thing I'll mention is, well, two things actually. Batteries are another resource where their costs could come down quite rapidly. We showed a projection of a 50% decline. I think others would argue with us that that's far too conservative, and that in fact there's new chemistries on the horizon that could turn that 50% decline into an 80 or 90% decline. So we didn't place any bets on those emerging chemistries, but they're definitely out there. There's enough IP being generated by advanced companies in the battery space that I'm not ruling that out. The last thing I'll say is that, as Alex alluded to, the study was relatively conservative because we looked at an asset-by-asset comparison. But what we see leading utilities do in their IRPs is not look asset by asset, can I avoid this gas plant? It's what is the least cost system that meets my customers' needs. And so we in our study are effectively sub-optimizing, whereas leading utilities have the tools and resources available to them to actually come up with the grand total clean energy portfolio, not the asset-specific clean energy portfolio. And that could be a substantial cost reduction compared to what we're showing here for some of the cases that we're looking at. So with that, we're out of time. Again, I apologize that we didn't get to everyone's questions. Feel free to ping me and Alex after this, and we'll do our best to respond by email or happy to hop back on the phone. Thanks again for joining, and stay tuned for other eLab webinars coming up.